My wife told me about her lover. After I cleared my in-laws' $300 get debts, he's moving in. Imagine this: your spouse comes home, looks you in the eye, and says, "I have a lover. And he's moving in." But that's just the start of what they have planned. My name's Liam, and what you're about to hear isn't just a betrayal, it's a carefully orchestrated takedown of everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and family. But don't think for a second that I let them get away with it. By the end of this story, I turned the tables in a way they never saw coming. Trust me, you don't want to miss a second of what happened next. When I first met Sophia, she felt like the answer to a question I'd never asked. It was one of those chance encounters, the kind people always say only happen in movies. I'd stopped by a friend's party, one of those upscale affairs in a big suburban home with sleek modern furniture, and just the right amount of mood lighting. She was standing near the fireplace, holding a glass of wine and laughing at something her friend had said. I remember how her laughter carried across the room, bright and unguarded, and for reasons I couldn't explain, it pulled me in. I introduced myself, made some stupid joke about the music being too loud, something lame, I'm sure, and to my surprise, she laughed again. That was the first time I saw her smile up close, the kind of smile that made you feel like the only person in the room. She had this effortless charm, the kind that made every word she said seem important. Within minutes, I was captivated. I'd been around plenty of people who were attractive or interesting, but Sophia was different. She didn't just draw attention, she held it. Looking back, it's easy to say I was naive. That first conversation wasn't just small talk. It felt like the start of something special. Sophia was sharp, funny, and so confident. I was used to people being polite or friendly, but Sophia made you feel like you mattered, like she'd chosen to focus her attention entirely on you. We talked for what felt like hours that night about our jobs, our favorite movies, the places we wanted to travel. She mentioned her parents, Daniel and Evelyn, a few times, in that offhanded way you do when you're not thinking about it. At the time, I didn't give it a second thought. They were just another detail about her life, another piece of her world that I was eager to learn about. I had no idea they'd play such a central role in what was to come. At the time, I was in a good place. I wasn't rich by any means, but I was comfortable. I'd worked my ass off in real estate, flipping houses and building a small portfolio of rental properties. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and I took pride in it. I'd come from a working-class family, the kind that didn't take anything for granted. My parents had sacrificed so much to give me a decent start, and I'd promised myself I wouldn't let that go to waste. When I met Sophia, it felt like all those years of hard work had finally paid off, not just in the material sense, but in the idea that I could finally share it all with someone who cared. We started dating, and everything seemed perfect. She was sweet, thoughtful, and quick with a joke that could cut through any awkward silence. On weekends, we'd drive out of the city to hike in the mountains, or visit those charming little towns with antique shops and coffee houses that never seemed to run out of fresh-baked scones. I even started looking forward to meeting her parents. She'd described Daniel and Evelyn as old school, with a hint of affection in her voice that made me think they'd be the kind of people who still wrote handwritten notes and kept photo albums on the living room table. When the time finally came to meet them, I was nervous but hopeful. I thought, if they raised Sophia, they must be good people, right? Their house was nothing like I'd imagined. I'd expected something quaint and well kept, but what I found was dated. The driveway had cracks running through it, the paint on the shutters was peeling, and the front door creaked when it opened. Inside, it was more of the same old furniture, worn carpeting, and that faint smell of something stale. Evelyn was the first to greet me. She was all smiles, her voice warm, but there was something about the way her eyes darted toward Daniel as he emerged from the back of the house that put me on edge. He shook my hand with a firm grip and a practiced grin, like he was trying to size me up in the first 5 seconds. They were polite enough, but the warmth felt calculated. I told myself I was just being overly critical. First impressions can be misleading, right? Over time, I started to notice patterns. Daniel always seemed to have a story about some deal that fell through or a project that never got off the ground. And Evelyn had a way of turning the smallest inconveniences into grand tragedies. The plumbing's acting up again, she'd say with a dramatic sigh. We just don't have the money to fix it right now. Or, Daniel's health isn't what it used to be. I wish we could afford a proper vacation to get him some rest. It was subtle at first, just little comments here and there, but soon it felt like every visit came with a new tale of woe. And then there was Sophia. At the time, I didn't notice how her tone would shift, how she'd start chiming in with little remarks that mirrored her parents' concerns. "They've been through so much," she'd say, her voice soft and persuasive. "I just wish I could do more for them." I started feeling a pull, a subtle but persistent pressure that made me wonder if I was the kind of guy who stepped up when it mattered. It wasn't that they asked for money outright. No, that would have been too obvious. Instead, it was an ongoing narrative of hardship, a steady drip of hints and sighs that made me feel like I should offer. I didn't at first. I kept my distance, telling myself I was overthinking it, that no one was really expecting me to shoulder their burdens. But as time went on, it became harder to ignore. Evelyn's sighs grew heavier, Daniel's stories more desperate, and Sophia's glances more pointed. It wasn't a request, it was a silent expectation. By then, Sophia and I were talking about our future, getting married, buying a house, starting a family. I was all in. She'd become my world, and I couldn't imagine a future without her. So when she started bringing up her parents' legacy, the home they'd lived in for decades, I listened. I wanted to be the guy who made things right, the guy who supported his wife-to-be. And that's when the whispers of doubt began to creep in. Was I really helping them out of love? Or was I being manipulated into carrying a burden that wasn't mine to bear? Still, I told myself it was just nerves. After all, what kind of man wouldn't want to help his future in-laws? Sophia's smile, her laughter, the way she made me feel like I was the only one who mattered, it was all too good to lose over a few nagging doubts. So I stayed quiet. I brushed off the uneasy feeling in my gut, and convinced myself that love meant sacrifice. That family meant helping each other no matter what. I had no idea I was walking straight into a trap, one that had been set long before I ever stepped through that creaking front door. Over time, the subtle hints and occasional sob stories from Sophia's parents turned into a steady drumbeat. Every conversation with Evelyn and Daniel seemed to revolve around the house. It was as if the walls themselves were crying out for help. Ancient plumbing, a leaky roof, creaking floors that groaned underfoot. "We've lived here for decades," Evelyn would say, her voice trembling, her hands clasped in that way that made her look so fragile. "We raised Sophia and her brothers in this home. It's not just a house, it's our legacy." Daniel would chime in, sighing heavily like the weight of the world was on his shoulders, shaking his head as if he were too proud to ask for help, but too defeated not to hope for it. I didn't say much at first. I'd just nod, offer a sympathetic smile, maybe say, "I'm sure things will work out." But deep down, I felt that creeping sense of responsibility. It wasn't long before the conversations grew more direct. Daniel and Evelyn weren't begging, not in so many words, but their carefully chosen comments left little room for interpretation. "We tried to get a second mortgage," Daniel told me one evening. He was holding a glass of iced tea, staring out the back window at the overgrown yard like it held the answers to all his problems. "But with the way things are these days, no bank wants to touch a place this old. They say it's too risky." Evelyn sat beside him, wringing her hands, her eyes misty. "It's just so hard, Liam," she said softly, "knowing we might lose everything we've worked for." I glanced at Sophia, hoping for some kind of reassurance that her parents weren't hinting at what I thought they were hinting at. But she just looked at me, her expression a mixture of concern and hope, as if she were silently willing me to say, "Don't worry, I'll help." I didn't say it, not then. But the thought started to fester. The turning point came one evening after dinner. We'd just finished Evelyn's famous chicken casserole, if by famous you meant bland and a little overcooked, and Daniel had poured himself a glass of whiskey. I was sitting in their living room, a room that had probably been considered stylish in the early 80s but now just felt tired. The wallpaper was faded, the couch cushions sagged, and the carpet had that faint musty smell of years gone by. Daniel leaned back in his recliner, his glass of whiskey balanced on his knee, and sighed deeply. "You know, I don't like to burden anyone with our problems," he began, which was my first clue that he was about to do exactly that. "But the truth is, Evelyn and I are at a crossroads. The bank's on our backs. The roof's on its last leg. The plumbing." He shook his head. "If something doesn't change soon, We're going to lose the house. I felt a lump rise in my throat. I wanted to say something comforting, something reassuring, but what came out was a simple, "I'm sorry to hear that." Evelyn's eyes met mine, wide and pleading. "Liam, this house is everything to us. It's not just where we live. It's where Sophia grew up. It's where we celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. Where we laughed and cried and..." Her voice cracked, and she brought a trembling hand to her face. "It's more than a house. It's our family's history." Sophia reached over and placed a hand on my arm. "We can't let them lose it, Liam," she whispered. "We just can't." The way she said it, so soft, so full of emotion, it hit me right in the gut. I didn't know what to say. All I knew was that every instinct I had was screaming at me to fix it, to be the guy who made it right. After all, wasn't that what a good man did? Took care of the people he loved? I nodded slowly, my chest tight. "Let me think about it," I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended. Sophia squeezed my arm, and for a moment, I felt like a hero. I had no idea I was walking into a trap. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about that evening, about the look on Evelyn's face, the desperation in Daniel's voice, the quiet pleading in Sophia's eyes. The words "their legacy" echoed in my head. A constant reminder that this wasn't just a financial problem, it was a family crisis. And I was part of that family now, wasn't I? I told myself I was overthinking it, that they weren't actually asking me to do anything. But then Sophia brought it up again. We were sitting on the couch in my apartment, a glass of wine in her hand, the TV muted as some old movie played in the background. She leaned against me, her head on my shoulder, and said softly, "Have you thought about what we talked about? About helping my parents?" My stomach twisted. "I've been thinking about it," I admitted, trying to keep my voice neutral. It's a lot of money, Sophia. I don't know if I can swing it." She tilted her head to look at me, her eyes big and sincere. "I know it's a lot, but it would mean the world to them. To us. This is our family, Liam. And family helps each other." Her words lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. I stared at the TV screen, not really seeing the images flickering there. My mind was racing. If I did this, if I helped them save their home, it would prove something. That I was all in. That I was willing to do whatever it took to be part of their family. But if I didn't, what kind of man would that make me? The question gnawed at me. Over the next week, the pressure mounted. Daniel and Evelyn didn't say anything outright, but their conversations with me were increasingly filled with those little what-if scenarios. "What if we just had a little help?" Daniel would say, his tone almost wistful. "What if we could fix the roof and keep the bank off our backs for a while?" Evelyn would nod along, her face etched with worry. "It would buy us time," she'd add, her voice trembling. "Time to figure things out. Time to rebuild." Even Sophia's demeanor changed. She'd bring me coffee in the morning, cook dinner more often, and say things like, "I know you're under a lot of stress. I just want you to know how much I appreciate you." It was subtle, but it was there, the unspoken expectation that I'd step up, that I'd be the guy who saved the day. Eventually, I caved. I couldn't take the weight of it anymore, the constant guilt, the feeling that I was somehow failing them by doing nothing. So one night, after a particularly emotional dinner at their place where Evelyn had cried over her casserole, and Daniel had sighed into his whiskey, I said, "Let me see what I can do." Sophia's face lit up, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Really?" she whispered. I nodded, even though my gut was screaming at me that I was making a mistake. "Yeah. I'll see if I can help." That's how I found myself cashing out investments, taking out a personal loan, and dipping into the savings I'd built over years of hard work. Every time I wrote a check, I told myself it was the right thing to do. Every time I handed over another payment, I convinced myself that this was what family did. When it was all said and done, I'd cleared their $300,000 debt. I'd saved their home. And for a brief moment, I felt like a hero again. Evelyn cried tears of joy, hugging me like I'd just cured some incurable disease. Daniel clapped me on the back and said, "You're a good man, Liam. We'll never forget this." Sophia kissed me, her smile wide and warm, and I thought, maybe this was all worth it. Maybe this was what love looked like. But deep down, there was that nagging voice. The one that whispered, "They played you." I shoved it aside, focusing on the good. I'd done, the peace I'd brought to their lives. I told myself that I was part of something bigger now, that I'd stepped up when it mattered. What I didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a nightmare I never saw coming, the beginning of a betrayal that would shatter everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and trust. So there I was standing in my own home, looking at the people I thought I could trust. I had given them everything, and now they were plotting behind my back. But here's the real question: what did I do next? Did I confront them head on? Did I gather my evidence and wait for the perfect moment? Or was there something else entirely that finally exposed their lies? Let me know what you think. Drop a 111 if you think I confronted them right then and there. Or at Woo22Fet if you think I bided my time and struck when they least expected it. The first cracks in my confidence appeared not long after I handed over that $300. At first, I convinced myself I'd done the right thing. Family helped family. It was the honorable choice. And I wanted to believe in the image I'd built up of myself: provider, protector, the guy who stood strong when others couldn't. But it didn't take long for the weight of my decision to settle in. When I looked at my bank statements and saw how much I'd sacrificed, that nagging doubt in the back of my mind grew louder. I thought clearing that debt would bring peace, that the worry and tension that hung over every dinner conversation would disappear. Instead, it felt like nothing had really changed. Daniel and Evelyn's relief was short-lived. They still complained about the roof needing repairs, the plumbing acting up, the bank calling them about this or that. The money I'd poured into their legacy hadn't fixed the underlying problems. It had just bought them a little more time to complain. I started noticing other things, too. Sophia was distant, more than I'd ever seen before. When I asked her what was wrong, she'd just say she was tired or that work was stressing her out. But her eyes had lost that warmth I'd fallen in love with. She spent more time at her parents' house than she did with me. It was always, "I'm just helping Mom with something," or "Dad needs me to go over some paperwork with him." I wanted to believe that was all it was. I told myself she was just being a good daughter. But deep down, I knew something was off. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, running through every interaction we'd had, every conversation, every look. The warmth in her voice, the way she used to greet me at the door with a smile, it was gone. In its place was something colder, more detached. Then there were the phone calls. Late at night, after Sophia had gone to bed or when she was out running errands, her phone would buzz with a text. Or she'd pick it up and walk into another room. I wasn't the kind of guy to snoop through my partner's messages, at least. I didn't think I was, but there's a certain point where your gut starts screaming at you. One night, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed again. It was sitting right there on the nightstand, screen lighting up. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. The name on the screen wasn't one I recognized, and the message was just a simple, "Can't wait to see you again." My heart dropped. For a moment, I thought it might be a coworker or friend, someone harmless. But something about the tone felt too familiar, too personal. I didn't confront her then. I wasn't ready. I put the phone back and sat there, staring at my hands, feeling my chest tighten like a vice. That nagging voice of doubt had become a shout. Over the next few weeks, my suspicions grew. I started noticing more little things, like how she'd change the subject if I asked about her day, or how she'd never invite me along to see her parents anymore. The distance between us felt like a canyon. I'd find myself sitting in the living room, staring at the pictures on the mantle, pictures of us from happier times, smiling at the beach, laughing at a barbecue, wondering where it all went wrong. It was hard to pin down the exact moment I realized she'd betrayed me. But when it hit like a freight train. I'd just come home from a long day at work, and Sophia wasn't there. No text, no note. I called her, and she didn't pick up. Hours went by, and still nothing. I sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand, staring at the clock, the seconds dragging like hours. Finally, well past midnight, she came through the door. I didn't yell. I didn't demand answers. I just looked at her and said, "Where were you?" Her answer was evasive. Vague, something about meeting a friend and losing track of time. I wanted to believe her, but her tone, her body language, everything about her felt off. My gut churned with doubt. That night, as she lay beside me, asleep or at least pretending to be, I stared at the ceiling, the weight of it all crushing down on me. The woman I'd given my heart to, the woman I'd trusted above all others, was lying to me. I didn't have proof, just a feeling. But that feeling was enough to keep me up all night. My mind racing, my stomach in knots. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I needed answers. I needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The next day, I started paying closer attention. I looked for patterns: how she'd leave at odd hours, how her phone was always on silent, how she'd be extra sweet to me after coming back from these errands. It wasn't long before I had enough little pieces to form a picture, one I didn't want to see. And then, one evening, it all came to a head. I came home to find her sitting on the couch, her hands clasped in her lap, her expression unusually serious. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but heavy. My heart sank. I sat down across from her, bracing myself for what was coming. She looked me in the eyes and said, "I've been seeing someone else." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt the air leave my lungs, my hands clenching into fists as I tried to process what she'd just said. "You're joking," I managed, though I knew she wasn't. She shook her head, her eyes downcast. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, the cliché words cutting deeper than any knife. "But it did, and I can't pretend it didn't." I didn't say anything at first. I just sat there, staring at her, trying to reconcile the woman I'd loved with the one sitting before me, admitting to the ultimate betrayal. The anger came next. "Who is he?" I demanded, my voice sharp, trembling with barely restrained rage. She hesitated, but I could see the answer in her eyes before she spoke it. "It doesn't matter," she said softly, which of course only made it worse. "It matters to me." I snapped, my voice rising. "You owe me that much." She looked at me, her expression a mix of guilt and defiance, and finally said his name. I didn't recognize it, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. She had betrayed me, not just with her body but with her heart. She had taken the trust I'd given her, the life I'd built with her, and shattered it into pieces. I didn't even know what to do at that moment. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw something, to lash out. But another part of me, the part that had been slowly dying inside for weeks, just felt hollow. I stood up, walked out of the room, and shut the door behind me. I needed air. I needed to think. I walked around the block, my mind racing, my chest tight. How had it come to this? How had I not seen it sooner? And more importantly, what was I supposed to do now? When I got back, she was gone. Her car was still in the driveway, but she wasn't in the house. I didn't bother looking for her. I just sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen, my thoughts spinning out of control. I felt betrayed, humiliated, angry beyond words. But more than that, I felt lost. The life I thought I had, the future I thought we were building, was gone. And I had no idea what was coming next. After Sophia's confession, my world felt like it had shattered into pieces. Every moment of our life together replayed in my mind like a cruel movie, each scene laced with doubt. I couldn't help but wonder how long she'd been lying, how long she'd been planning this. The trust I had once given so freely had been replaced by a toxic mix of anger, disbelief, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. But even as I wrestled with my emotions, a part of me refused to sit back and let her walk away without consequences. I knew I had to do something, anything, to take back some semblance of control. At first, I didn't know where to start. The thought of confronting her again made my stomach churn, but staying silent felt even worse. I began by looking at the facts. I pulled up bank statements, receipts, and every piece of paperwork I had related to the money I'd poured into that house. The more I dug, the clearer the picture became. I hadn't just given them money. I'd essentially bought the place out from under them. The mortgage was in my name, the payments all documented. I had the legal footing, and that realization was the first spark of hope I'd felt in weeks. I wasn't powerless. I had leverage, and if I used it right, I could turn this around. I spent late nights at the dining room table, poring over documents and jotting down notes. My laptop screen glowed in the darkness as I read and reread the contracts I'd signed, the agreements I'd made. I didn't have a lawyer on retainer or a fancy legal team, but I wasn't going into this blind. Every click of the keyboard, every page I printed, felt like a small step toward reclaiming what was mine. I wasn't going to let her take the house, not without a fight. This wasn't just about money. It was about respect, about standing up for myself when everything else had been taken from me. In the days that followed, I started seeing Sophia and her parents in a new light. I remembered the way Daniel would always lean just a little too heavily on his stories of hardship. How Evelyn's tears seemed to fall right on cue. At the time, I'd chalked it up to bad luck, to the struggles of an aging couple trying to keep their home. Now, I realized it had all been part of a well-rehearsed act. They'd played me, plain and simple. And Sophia had been right there in the middle of it, not just complicit but leading the charge. That thought made my blood boil. She wasn't just some victim of circumstance, she was the architect of my humiliation. And that made my resolve even stronger. I started watching their movements more carefully. Sophia still came and went at odd hours, but now I paid attention. I noticed when she'd head out to help her mom and return hours later without so much as a text. I kept my distance, let her think I was too broken to do anything about it. But every time she left, I added another piece to the puzzle. I checked the mail, looked at bills and notices that came in her name. I wasn't just looking for confirmation of what I already knew. I was building a case. I didn't plan on taking her to court, not yet, but I wanted to be ready if it came to that. If she tried to take more than she already had, I'd have the proof to stop her. It wasn't just about the house, though. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how far the deception went. She hadn't just been seeing someone else. She'd been living a double life, one where I was the steady, dependable provider, and the other man was the excitement, the thrill. The thought of it made my chest tighten. I thought back to all the nights she'd come home late, her excuses vague and unconvincing. I'd been too trusting, too willing to believe in her, and she'd taken full advantage of that. Now, every time she walked through the door, I felt like I was seeing a stranger. The woman I'd loved was gone, replaced by someone cold, calculated, and unrecognizable. I didn't confront her again right away. Instead, I kept gathering information, building a strategy. I wasn't going to yell or throw accusations. I was going to use her own lies against her. I began quietly talking to people who might know more. I called up an old friend who worked in real estate law, asking hypothetical questions about ownership rights and marital assets. I reached out to a financial advisor I hadn't spoken to in years, explaining that I needed to reassess my holdings but really just looking for guidance on how to protect myself. Every conversation gave me more confidence that I wasn't as helpless as I'd felt that night she'd confessed. I had options, and I was going to use them. Then came the day I found the smoking gun. While cleaning out my desk drawer, I came across an old folder I'd nearly forgotten about. Inside was a notarized statement, signed by both Daniel and Evelyn, transferring their home's deed to me in exchange for that $300. At the time, I'd insisted on it as a formality, never imagining I'd actually need to enforce it. Now, holding that piece of paper, I felt a surge of vindication. They had no claim to the house. It wasn't their legacy anymore, it was mine. And if Sophia thought she could kick me out, she had another thing coming. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with that deed in front of me, sipping a glass of bourbon and letting the weight of the moment settle in. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I had a plan. The rage and humiliation I'd felt were still there, but now they were tempered by a sense of purpose. I wasn't going to let her get away with what she'd done. I wasn't going to let them win. For the first time since her confession, I felt like I had the upper hand. I didn't know what Sophia's next move would be, but I knew mine. When the time came, I'd be ready. And when she tried to take what wasn't hers, I'd make sure she regretted every lie she'd ever told. As I gathered my evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was wading deeper into a swamp of lies. Every new discovery was a fresh betrayal, a reminder that the people I'd trusted most had been weaving a web around me for months, maybe years. It wasn't just Sophia's affair, it was the way she and her parents had maneuvered behind my back, conspiring to keep me in the dark. I started to notice patterns, things I'd ignored before. Daniel's stories about bad investments, Evelyn's exaggerated health woes, even the carefully rehearsed tears, they were all part of the same performance, designed to make me feel like the savior they needed, the guy who'd swoop in and fix their lives. They'd been playing me for a fool, and I'd fallen for it. But now, I wasn't the same man they'd so easily manipulated. I was angry, yes, but more than that, I was focused. I'd spent years learning how to negotiate deals, how to spot a bad investment, how to read people, and now I was using those skills on the very people who'd made me believe I was part of their family. I began quietly building my case, not just on paper but in my head. I paid closer attention to every interaction, every conversation. I didn't let on that I knew what they were up to. Instead, I played the part of the tired, defeated husband, the guy who was too broken to fight back. But inside, I was plotting my next move. I started recording conversations when I visited their house, capturing Evelyn's subtle guilt trips and Daniel's offhand comments about how lucky they were to have me around. I combed through emails, looking for inconsistencies. I even dug into their financial history records. I'd helped organize before only to find more red flags. Bank statements that didn't add up, unexplained withdrawals, a pattern of borrowing money from friends and family only to forget to pay it back. They'd been living on a financial cliff for years, and I'd been their safety net. But not anymore. It wasn't just about gathering proof, it was about seeing the truth for what it was. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how calculated their actions had been. They hadn't just stumbled into financial trouble and turned to me in desperation. No, they'd seen me as a solution from the start. The charming new boyfriend who had a stable career, who owned property, who had a reputation for being generous and reliable. They'd sized me up before I even knew what was happening. It was infuriating to think that the love I'd felt for Sophia had been weaponized against me. I'd trusted her, believed in her, and she'd used that trust as leverage to keep me in the dark. The realization made my chest tighten, but it also hardened my resolve. They thought they'd fooled me completely. They thought I was still in their pocket, too naive or too kind to see through their act. But they were wrong. I saw everything now, and I was determined to make them pay for it. Once I had enough evidence, I started preparing for the inevitable confrontation. I knew it wouldn't be a single explosive moment where I threw everything in their faces and watched them crumble. No. This needed to be a calculated move, one that left no room for them to wriggle out of responsibility. I consulted with my lawyer friend, laying out the documents and recordings I'd collected. He wasn't surprised by what he saw. He'd seen similar schemes before, but he was impressed by how thoroughly I'd documented everything. "You've got them nailed to the wall," he said, flipping through the files. "They won't be able to dispute any of this." Hearing those words felt like a small victory, a reminder that I wasn't powerless. I'd been beaten down, humiliated, and betrayed, but I still had the ability to fight back. I still had the tools to reclaim what was mine. I didn't stop there. I reached out to a few people who knew the family, former friends, distant relatives, even some of Daniel's old business partners. I wanted to get a fuller picture of how long this had been going on, how many others they'd burned in the past. What I found was a pattern, a history of manipulation and deceit. Daniel had a reputation for being charming in the same way. A con artist was charming. He'd talk a good game, make people feel like they were part of something special, only to leave them hanging when things went south. Evelyn was no better. She had a knack for spinning sob stories, playing the victim to get what she wanted. And Sophia? She wasn't just following in their footsteps, she was leading the charge. Her role wasn't passive. She wasn't just a daughter trying to help her parents. She was the one pulling the strings, making sure I stayed hooked long enough to pour my resources into their sinking ship. It was a bitter pill to swallow, realizing that the woman I'd loved had been the mastermind of my downfall. But it also gave me clarity. If she thought I'd roll over and let them win, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. As I pieced together the timeline of events, I saw the betrayal in stark relief. They'd started working on me from the beginning, planting the seeds of obligation, making me feel like part of their family. They'd used every tool at their disposal: flattery, guilt, tears to keep me on the hook. And when the time came to cash in, they didn't hesitate. Sophia had played her part perfectly, drawing me closer, making me feel needed, making me believe that helping them was the same as helping her. But now, with all the pieces in place, I could see the cracks in their story. The inconsistencies, the lies, the subtle cues that hinted at what they were really after. And I was ready to use every one of those against them. I didn't know exactly how the confrontation would go down, but I knew it was coming. I could feel it building, a tension that hung in the air every time I saw them. They didn't know what I knew. They didn't see the storm gathering on the horizon. And that gave me the upper hand. I kept my poker face, acted like nothing had changed, while I continued to prepare. Every day that passed brought me closer to the moment when I'd finally lay it all out. When I'd show them the proof of their betrayal, when I'd watch their smug confidence crumble, they thought they'd won. They thought I was just a pawn in their game, but they were about to find out that I wasn't just playing. I was ready to turn the board upside down and end the game for good. As the days passed, I found myself caught in a silent war. Every interaction with Sophia and her parents felt like a game of chess, each of us trying to anticipate the other's next move. I played my part well, just as they had taught me. I stayed calm, kept my questions light, and pretended not to notice the subtle shifts in their behavior. Inside, though, I was on high alert. The more time I spent around them, the more I realized just how carefully they had been orchestrating everything. It was in the way Daniel would casually mention the next steps for the house, as though I had already agreed to fund further renovations. Or the way Evelyn's teary glances lingered just a second too long, silently urging me to keep being the dependable son-in-law. And then there was Sophia, who had become almost painfully sweet. She made me coffee in the mornings, asked me how my day went, even suggested we take a weekend trip together, something she hadn't brought up in months. It would have been easy to mistake her behavior for an attempt at reconciliation, but I knew better. This wasn't love, it was damage control. Still, I stayed quiet. I let them think I was still under their spell. I let Sophia's parents believe I was the dutiful son-in-law, too naive or too kind-hearted to see what was really going on. And I let Sophia think her charm could smooth over the cracks that had been forming for months. But while they carried on their charade, I was working behind the scenes. I spent nights at my desk, reviewing every piece of documentation I could find. I pulled up financial records, emails, even old text messages. I needed to be absolutely certain that when the moment came, I'd have everything I needed to prove what they'd done. Because they weren't just going to admit it, not people like them. They'd deny, deflect, and twist the story until it suited them. So I was going to make sure there was no room for doubt. It wasn't easy. Every time I uncovered another piece of evidence, I felt a fresh wave of anger. I'd find emails between Daniel and Sophia that painted a much clearer picture of their scheme. Messages like, "Make sure he thinks this is his idea," or "We just need him to sign off on the transfer." They didn't even try to hide it. They talked about me like I was some clueless mark, a stepping stone to their happy ending. And then there were the financial statements, withdrawals and expenses that had nothing to do with the house repairs, trips and purchases I'd never approved. They had been using my money as their personal safety net, their fallback plan when everything else failed. And Sophia? She had been right there with them, orchestrating it all. The woman I thought I knew was a stranger, someone who saw me not as a partner, but as a means to an end. At night, when I couldn't sleep, I'd sit in the darkened living room, a drink in hand, replaying every conversation we'd ever had. The I love yous that now felt hollow. The smiles that seemed more calculated than sincere. I'd stare out the window at the streetlights, their pale glow illuminating a neighborhood that suddenly felt foreign. This was supposed to be home. She was supposed to be my family. But now, everything felt tainted. The house itself seemed to carry the weight of their betrayal, the walls holding secrets I hadn't been privy to. It was like the very foundation was cracked, the structure of my life crumbling under the weight of their lies. And yet, through it all, I knew I couldn't let them see me break. I couldn't let them know that I'd figured it out. So I carried on, nodding along as Daniel spoke about future plans, and offering polite smiles when Evelyn asked me if I wanted a second helping of her casserole. I let Sophia's affectionate gestures pass without comment, even as they felt like tiny daggers. I didn't confront them, not yet. I didn't storm out of the house or demand answers. Instead, I waited. I bided my time, knowing that patience was my strongest weapon. Every day that passed brought me closer to the moment when I'd finally turn the tables. They thought they were in control, but they were wrong. The power wasn't in their hands anymore. It was in mine. And as I sat there in the dark, watching the faint glimmers of light on the horizon, I felt a strange sense of calm. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, it was all still there. But it wasn't consuming me anymore. It had been replaced by something colder, something sharper. Resolve. I wasn't just going to confront them. I was going to expose them. I was going to take back what was mine, piece by piece, and leave them with nothing. Because this wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. It was about reclaiming my life from the people who had tried to steal it from me. And when the time came, I knew exactly what I'd do. The confrontation I had been preparing for came faster than I expected. It was a gray, rainy afternoon, the kind that made everything feel heavier and more urgent. I had just finished organizing the last of the documentation, every statement, every email, every receipt, and I felt ready. Ready to stand my ground, ready to finally call them out. I sat at the dining room table, staring at the pile of evidence in front of me, my fingers drumming against the edge of my laptop. The house was quiet except for the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. And then I heard the door open. Sophia's voice drifted in, light and casual. "I'm home," she called out, as if nothing had changed. I stayed where I was, letting her walk into the kitchen and see me sitting there. When she did, she paused, her eyes flicking to the stack of papers on the table. Her smile faltered. "What's all this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but I caught the tension in it. I looked up at her, calm and steady. "It's everything," I said, motioning to the pile. "Every document, every receipt, every email, proof of what you've done." She froze, her hand still clutching the doorframe. "What are you talking about?" Her tone was defensive, but her eyes gave her away. They darted to the papers, then to me, then back again. She was scrambling, trying to gauge how much I knew, how much I'd figured out. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my gaze on her. "You've been lying to me for months, maybe longer. You and your parents. I have the emails, the bank statements, the deeds. I know about the money you took, the trips you paid for, the renovations that never happened. I know everything." Sophia's face hardened, her shoulders straightening as she walked fully into the room. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice low and controlled. "You've got it all wrong." I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Do I? Because I've got your messages right here. Make sure he thinks this is his idea. Remember that one? Or how about, we just need him to sign off on the transfer." You weren't even subtle. Her eyes widened for just a split second before narrowing into a glare. "You went through my private messages?" I let out a short laugh. "Private? You mean the ones you sent on our shared account? The ones you left sitting in our inbox?" "Yeah, I read them. And you know what? I'm glad I did. Because now I know exactly who I've been married to." Sophia crossed her arms, her jaw clenched tight. "You're being ridiculous. You're blowing this out of proportion." "Am I?" I shot back, my voice rising just slightly. "You and your parents have been using me from day one. You lied about the house, the money, everything. You made me believe we were building a life together. And all the while, you were planning to cut me out. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? To realize that the person you trusted the most was working against you?" She didn't answer, her silence louder than any excuse she could have given. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting to the papers again. She was calculating, trying to figure out how to spin this, how to turn it around. But I wasn't done. I stood up, taking the stack of documents and flipping through them. "I have it all here. Proof that the house is in my name. Proof that I paid off your parents' debts. Proof that I kept every promise while you broke every single one." I stepped closer to her, holding the papers between us. "What do you have, Sophia? What excuse can you possibly give me?" She took a step back, her bravado slipping. "Liam, just listen." "No," I said sharply. "You've done enough talking. I'm done listening to your lies." The tension in the room was suffocating. The sound of the rain outside suddenly louder, more insistent. Sophia's mask of composure cracked, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. She wasn't in control anymore. I was. "I'm giving you a choice," I said, my voice low and firm. "You can pack your things and leave. Or you can try to fight this and lose. Either way, you're not staying here." Her eyes widened in shock. "You can't just throw me out." "Watch me," I replied, my jaw set. "This house is mine. I have the documents, the legal proof. You have nothing. So pack your bags and get out." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. She knew I was serious. She knew I wasn't backing down. "I'll give you until tomorrow," I said, stepping back and turning away. "If you're still here, I'll have the cops remove you." I walked out of the room without looking back, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. I could hear her scrambling behind me, her voice rising in protests and excuses. But I didn't stop. I didn't respond. I had done what I came to do. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table long after Sophia had stormed upstairs, her anger echoing in my ears. I didn't feel victorious. Not yet. The confrontation was the first step, but I knew there was more to come. I still had to deal with Daniel and Evelyn. They'd been quieter than usual lately, keeping their distance. I knew they'd heard the argument, every word carried through the thin walls of this old house. I imagined them huddled in their bedroom, whispering to each other, trying to figure out their next move. But I wasn't going to give them the chance. The way I saw it, they had two options: pack up and leave, or be dragged out kicking and screaming. The next morning, I heard their door creak open. I stayed at the table, sipping my coffee, waiting. Daniel was the first to step into the hallway. He looked rough, his gray hair was disheveled, and his usual smug grin was gone. For once, he didn't have that confident swagger, that salesman's charm he always used to disarm people. Evelyn followed behind him, her face pale, her eyes darting around like she was looking for an escape route. She clutched her robe tightly, her fingers trembling. I wondered if she'd been crying, but if she had, it wasn't out of guilt. No, Evelyn cried only when it suited her, when there was something to gain. Now she just looked scared. I liked that. Fear was better than crocodile tears. Daniel cleared his throat, standing at the edge of the kitchen. "Morning, Liam," he said, his voice low and strained. I didn't look up. "Daniel." Evelyn tried to step in, her voice soft, trembling. "Liam, we need to talk." I set my coffee down slowly and finally met their eyes. "What could you possibly have to say?" Evelyn glanced at Daniel, who nodded at her to continue. She took a small step forward, her shoulders hunched. We didn't mean for things to get so complicated. We thought we were doing the right thing for the family. For Sophia." I let out a bitter laugh. "The right thing? Really?" I stood up, towering over them. "You lied to me. You used me. And now you want to stand here and tell me you had good intentions? That you were looking out for Sophia?" Evelyn shrank back, clutching Daniel's arm. He stepped in front of her, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Look, I know we've made mistakes," he said, his voice smoother now, slipping back into his practiced tone. "But this doesn't have to end badly. We're all family. We can work something out." I took a step closer, my fists clenched. "Family? Don't you dare use that word. Family doesn't do what you've done. Family doesn't steal from each other, lie to each other. You think I'm just going to forget everything? Pretend it never happened? Not a chance." Daniel's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to losing control, and it showed. "What do you want from us, Liam? You want us to pack up and leave? Fine. But we need some time. A few weeks, at least." "Evelyn needs to." "No." I cut him off, my voice sharp and unyielding. "You have 2 days. That's it. 2 days to get out." Evelyn gasped, her eyes widening. "But where will we go?" I stared at her, my expression cold. "That's not my problem." She started to cry, the tears streaming down her face. "We have nowhere else. We've lived here for decades. This is our home." "Not anymore," I said, my voice steady. "It's my home now." Daniel stepped forward, his face darkening. "You don't have to be like this, Liam." I met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm exactly like this because of you. You created this mess. You took advantage of me. And now you're going to deal with the consequences." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. I could see the panic in Evelyn's eyes, the way her hands clung to Daniel's arm. And Daniel? He was finally starting to realize that his charm, his smooth words, weren't going to save him this time. They had pushed me too far, and there was no coming back from that. "I suggest you start packing," I said, stepping back toward the table. "Because in 2 days, if you're not out, I'll make sure you're removed. Legally." Evelyn let out a choked sob, burying her face in Daniel's shoulder. He glanced down at her, then back at me. "You'll regret this, Liam," I smirked, shaking my head. "No. I think I'll finally get some peace." They left the kitchen without another word, their footsteps heavy as they disappeared down the hall. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the rain outside, the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. I'd done what needed to be done. There was no turning back now. This was my house, my life, and I wasn't going to let them destroy it any further. I had made my stand, and for the first time in months, I felt in control. They thought they could manipulate me, break me. But now they knew the truth. I wasn't the man they thought I was. I was stronger, smarter, and I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I picked up my coffee, sat back down at the table, and stared at the stack of papers in front of me. They had underestimated me, and now they were paying the price. 2 days. That's all they had. 2 days, and then I'd finally have my house back. My life back. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time, I felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. The last 48 hours were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Evelyn's sobs, Daniel's bitter tone, and the heavy shuffle of their footsteps down the hallway. They were still there. Even though I'd made it clear that their time was up, they hadn't made any visible progress toward leaving. A stack of boxes had appeared near the living room couch, but it seemed more like a gesture than an actual effort. They thought they could outlast me, wait until I softened or gave them more time. But that wasn't going to happen. I was done being the guy who made concessions, the guy who let them walk all over me. I'd given them 2 days, and now the clock was down to hours. By the end of the day, I'd have my house back, no excuses, no delays. I kept telling myself that, letting it anchor me as I prepared for the inevitable storm. It wasn't just about them leaving. This was the culmination of months of lies, manipulation, and betrayal. I knew that when the moment came, it wouldn't be quiet. Evelyn wasn't the type to leave without one last performance. Daniel wasn't the type to walk out without trying to make me feel like the bad guy. And Sophia, well, I hadn't seen much of her since the confrontation. But I knew she wasn't going to go quietly. None of them were. They'd been planning their next move while I made mine. I didn't know what it would look like, but I knew it was coming. They weren't the kind of people to take their losses gracefully. They'd fight back, try to twist the narrative one last time. I was ready for that, too. When the sun rose on the final day, I was already up. I stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the street, the faint hum of passing cars a distant reminder that the rest of the world was moving on, oblivious to the battle playing out behind these walls. I sipped my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me, and listened to the creak of floorboards upstairs. They were awake, moving around, probably trying to decide how to play this. The house felt tense, like the air itself was holding its breath. I set my mug down and made my way to the living room, where the boxes still sat untouched. It was almost funny. They thought they could delay the inevitable by just standing still, but time was no longer on their side. I called my lawyer first thing, confirming that all the paperwork was in order. "You're covered," he told me. "If they're still there by tonight, you have every right to bring in law enforcement." I thanked him and hung up, my resolve solidifying. This was it. They had no more moves. I had played my hand carefully, made sure there were no loopholes, no misunderstandings. This house was mine, and they were squatters, plain and simple. I almost felt sorry for them almost. If they hadn't spent so much time lying, manipulating, and plotting behind my back, I might have offered them more leniency. But they had burned that bridge long before I discovered the truth. So now, I wasn't the bad guy. I was just a man taking back what was rightfully his. I didn't have to wait long before Evelyn emerged from the hallway. She looked tired, her eyes puffy, her expression strained. "Liam," she said, her voice cracking, "we need to talk." I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorway. "There's nothing to talk about. You have until the end of the day." Her eyes filled with tears, and she wrung her hands together like she always did when she was trying to appear vulnerable. "Please," she whispered. "Just give us a little more time. We're trying, but it's so much to pack. We just need a few more days." I shook my head, my voice firm. "No, Evelyn. I gave you 2 days. That's more than enough. You've had weeks, months to figure this out. I'm done waiting." She reached out, her voice rising. "But where will we go? We have nothing, Liam. We have no one." "Not my problem," I said sharply. "You should have thought about that before you decided to con me." Evelyn's face twisted in anger, her tears drying up almost instantly. "Con you? We never, don't lie to me," I cut her off, my voice louder now. "I've seen the emails, the bank statements. I know exactly what you did. You used me. You saw me as a way to fix your mess, and when I stopped being useful, you tried to push me out. I'm done being your safety net." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I didn't give her a chance to recover. I turned away and walked back to the kitchen, leaving her standing there. I knew she'd be back, but I wasn't going to listen anymore. I'd said what I needed to say. The next step was up to them. As the hours ticked by, the tension in the house only grew. Daniel tried to talk to me once, his tone calm and measured. "Let's be reasonable," he said. "We don't want this to get ugly." "It's already ugly," I replied, my voice cold. "You made it that way." He didn't argue. He just shook his head, muttering something under his breath, and walked away. That was fine with me. I wasn't interested in their excuses anymore. All I cared about was getting them out. I spent the rest of the day making sure everything was ready. I double-checked my documents, reviewed the eviction process, and even spoke to a friend in law enforcement who assured me they could send someone over if needed. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I was fully prepared. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't angry. I was just ready. When the clock struck 7, I heard movement upstairs. Doors opening and closing, muffled voices. They were packing. Finally realizing that I wasn't bluffing, I waited in the living room, the silence punctuated by the occasional thud of a box hitting the floor. It was almost surreal. For months I'd felt powerless in my own home, but now, I was in control. They had no choice but to leave, and they knew it. As they carried the last of their things down the stairs, I didn't say a word. Evelyn glared at me, her eyes still red and swollen, while Daniel kept his head down, his jaw tight. Sophia was the last to appear, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at me as she walked past, her bag slung over her shoulder. The door opened, the cool night air rushing in, and just like that, they were gone. I stood there for a long time after the door closed, the silence almost deafening. I should have felt relieved, but what I felt was something more complicated. It wasn't victory. It wasn't satisfaction. It was a mix of exhaustion, grief, and a strange sense of peace. They were gone, and the house was mine again. But the damage they'd done, the lies they'd told, it would take time to process all of it. For now, though, I had the one thing I'd been fighting for, my home. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and sat down at the dining room table. The pile of papers was still there, a reminder of everything that had happened. I picked up one of the documents, a copy of the deed with my name on it, and set it aside. I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need proof. I knew what was mine, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me again. For the first time in months, I felt in control of my life. The storm had passed, and now I could finally begin to rebuild. And there you have it when it was all said and done. I not only protected my home and my future, but I made sure they never saw it coming. It wasn't easy. It wasn't without its struggles. But it was worth every single step. I know I'm not the only one who's been through something like this. Have you ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted? Have you ever had to stand your ground and fight for what's yours? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like button if you love a story where justice is finally served. What I learned from all of this is simple. Protect what's yours. Trust is earned, not given. Don't let anyone, family, friend, or partner take advantage of your hard work and sacrifices. In America, your financial independence, your home, and your peace of mind are your responsibilities. If you see the warning signs, don't ignore them. Speak up, take action, and hold your ground. Standing firm isn't just about protecting what you own, it's about protecting your dignity. Never be afraid to stand up for yourself, because no one else will do it for you.